Thursday, January 14, 6:33 p.m. I'm calling the Board of Selectmen meeting to order. This meeting is being recorded. This is another public forum and workshop to discuss elements of the 40B proposal that is before us. The structure of tonight's meeting will be but first, we're going to have a couple of presentations of some peer review information from two consultants. And we'll spend about probably 15 minutes or so on each of the presentations. We'll take questions from board members on that, and I will open it up to questions from the public for a limited period of time at that point. And then after that, the Board of Selectmen is going to discuss some next steps, and as time permits, I will allow some additional public comment at the end of that. So before we go into the presentations, I'm going to take a moment to reiterate what I've said before about this process. We're here. Why we're here, what we're doing here is we have a 40B proposal that is before us from a developer. And there are two basic processes that this can follow. One is the process that we're trying to go through right now, which is the local initiative project, or the so-called friendly 40B. And in that process, the Board of Selectmen negotiates with the developer to see if we can come to an agreement where we can provide a letter of endorsement for the project with certain conditions to constrain the project. And with that letter of endorsement, the developer goes to the state, they get a letter of eligibility, and then they come back to the Zoning Board of Appeals to get their comprehensive permit sorted out. In the other version of the process, where they don't do a local initiative process, or it's not a friendly 40B, developer again goes to the state, they get their letter of eligibility, and once again they end up at the Zoning Board of Appeals for their comprehensive permit. And in both cases, they will go through the Zoning Board of Appeals, and a number of issues will be sorted out by the Zoning Board of Appeals and Concom. A lot of nitty-gritty details around things that can be adjudicated by those boards, such as stormwater runoff, environmental aspects that are where the developer is still constrained by the state, septic. But in the second version of in the first version of the process, the Board of Selectmen can negotiate certain conditions, but the Zoning Board of Appeals cannot. So there are advantages to the town to be able to go through that process and obtain some conditions that are beneficial to the town. And that's why we're going through this first phase to see if we can come to a negotiated agreement with a developer. And if we don't, they will again go to the state and go and get their letter of eligibility. There they go. I'm going to ask folks to mute themselves if they're not speaking.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just have to.
Is that Craig Seymour's? I don't know who's, I can't hear anything.
There we go. Okay.
Eli?
So in any case.
Eli?
Yes, Alan?
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but someone is repeatedly clearing their throat and it's interfering with how we can hear you. I would be grateful if whoever it is would mute their audio.
Two different processes. One in which the Board of Selectmen can negotiate some constraints on the project which might benefit the town, and the other one where the Board of Selectmen gives up some of those constraints. And so whether or not the project goes ahead, the developer may run into issues in the later phases of the project that still prevent the project from going ahead. And that's regardless of what we negotiate here. So and there are some benefits to the town to going through this process of negotiation. And that's why we're doing it now. So in the previous meetings, we went through and we got some consultants to do some work for us on fiscal impact, on traffic and environmental. Tonight, we're going to have 2 presentations on those. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Greg to fire those folks up.
Okay, so first up, we have our consultants from RKG Associates, and we have Larry Craner, who's the principal author of the peer review under the fiscal analysis. And with that, I'll turn it over to Larry, and we can begin. Craig, I think you may have some background noise going on.
You think so? Let me mute out then.
Yeah, it's definitely coming from you. I'm sorry to say.
Well, this is Larry. Thank you all for having us and for the time to speak with you. I'm actually going to turn it over to Craig just for a minute so he can do some introductions and recaps. Craig is a longtime member of RKG, and now he's not. So I'm going to defer to him for a little bit of introductory notes, and then we can just slip right into the PowerPoint and the discussion, if that's good with everybody there.
Larry, I'm picking up they're picking up some background noise for me, so I'll be very brief, just to say that I'm a senior associate with RKG Associates. We've been doing fiscal impact analysis and other municipal planning work around New England for nearly 40 years. We're familiar with Fougère's analysis. We've peer reviewed him before, and I'll let Larry just step through the slides and summarize our findings on that. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, thank you. And Greg, if you could just flip the slide, that'd be great, please. On the PowerPoint.
Yeah. For some reason, it's not advancing. Why is that?
Well, I'm not sure, but we can talk it through. It's not a detailed PowerPoint.
Working fine a minute ago.
Okay. Well, essentially, as Craig had mentioned, we've been active.
Just let me interrupt for just a minute, Larry. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Eli, is anyone else screen sharing?
As far as I know, we're all screen sharing.
They shouldn't be able to now.
Somehow markings got on the screen, and I don't seem to have control of my screen.
That's a Zoom feature.
Or
Greg, you might want to try just closing it out of that mode, that mode, and just going back into the next slide individually.
there we go. There's a little extraneous line on it here and there, but that's all right. That could be my computer. Any rate, as Craig had mentioned, we've been active doing fiscal impacts and peer reviews for quite some time, and we are familiar with the work by Fougère Planning and Department. And essentially, we were brought on board to just offer an independent take at the fiscal impact analysis that he prepared on behalf of the developer for the proposed sanctuary project, which, to recap, is 157 rental apartments. It's a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. And as we understand it, there's to be about 39 affordable, and 150 or 118 market rate units. And the report that we submitted really goes through it line by line and page by page. And in general, we concur with the report, and I'll just call it the report, the assumptions and methodologies in the report. We wanted to verify them, and as we've worked with and peer reviewed Frugeri before, we sometimes at RKG have a little different take on it, but by and large, we concur with the assumptions and the methodology that were used in the report, with an exception here and there. In summary, the report has two estimates of potential impacts. One is where they consider a low education cost, if you will, which was a direct approach looking at adding a teacher and maybe cost incurred by any special needs children as a result of the project. And the other was using an average per student cost. And what we looked at as we peer reviewed it and created an alternative model was the one that used the average per student cost, because it came out to be a higher cost for education to the town. And if it changed dramatically, then the estimate of net fiscal impacts would change dramatically. And the short of that combined review is that, and if you wanted to switch to the next slide, that would be great, please, is that the report came out with about 132,000 in estimated net fiscal impacts, positive, and RKG came slightly below that. The variances, as you can see on the slide there, are that we at RKG excluded the CPA taxes. We realize that they are received, but it's generally our understanding that those are a dedicated tax, and they're not really to be used for the town general fund and municipal service costs. And Frugeri also in the report did not include the taxes from the property as it is developed. I mean, I'm assuming that it's reasonable that his estimate of value includes apartments, land, and the whole kit and caboodle, so it makes sense, at least to us, to take out the existing taxes as essentially a loss of revenue. So those two components are different with respect to revenue and with respect to expenses. And the other different component with respect to expenses is on the number of students and the cost of those students, which we'll discuss as we move along. Next slide, please. So in short, the revenues are represented by three major areas. There's the property tax receipts, and both he and we looked at 2020 rates of $11.70 per thousand, and based on the estimate of value for the property of about $44.2 million, that comes out to tax receipts of $517,600. That's all on that last slide. The one thing that we did comment on in the report, and we'll talk about as we go through this, is that based on 157 units, that comes out to a valuation of almost $282,000 per unit, which is a little bit high in our experience working in other communities elsewhere throughout Massachusetts, but it's not unreasonable given modern new construction, and particularly with four-story, multi-storied residential properties with parking. Excise tax receipts were estimated in the report at about $98,000. This is on the assumption of 1.25 cars per unit. And looking at historical excise tax with the town, and then the community preservation tax, which we agree will be there, but we don't consider it as a revenue source. So the variation then in net revenues between the report and RKG is about $7,000, $623 versus $615,000. Next slide, please. So from this, as a source of revenue, we got to start deducting all of the costs to the town to provide services. And three major areas were presented. Additional costs for the police department, additional costs for fire and EMS, and additional student costs. In the report, there are several methodologies for analyzing these costs, and an accepted methodology is an estimate of cost per call and an increase in service calls. And both he and we spoke with the police chief regarding this. The chief thought that the call volume may be a bit low based on some research that he had done in other communities with 40B projects. But he also noted that when he spoke with department heads in those communities, none had resulted in the requiring of additional police personnel. We also spoke with the fire chief, as did Frugieri in the report, and there was an estimate of about 11 calls for fire and 16 for EMS at a per cost call, less a reimbursement for EMS services. So the net cost for all of that was around $23,000. The net cost prior for police was around $28,000, and both of those have to be deducted from the revenues that we mentioned earlier. The DPW, we spoke with the department head, and it's our understanding, as his and as presented in the report, that all maintenance, trash, snow plowing will be taken care of and an expense borne by the developer and the owner of the sanctuary. But a annual figure of about $10,000 was thrown in there for contingencies or unknowns. We thought these costs to be reasonable, and in reviewing our conversations with the department heads, they generally tended to concur, and I'll make note later on of the police chief's comment. So between that, the total costs for the town were about $61,000 for those three elements. And yep, okay, that's fine. Education cost. The big chunk then becomes the cost for education. And what was done in this analysis was that a school-age children multiplier or per bedroom metric was applied to the 2 and 3 bedroom units. And from that, the report estimated approximately 30 students. We noted in the report and in our discussions with Superintendent Pam, Bowden, I think, correct, and the Director of Finance, Avi Urbis, that they had a little concern or issue of the potential for students coming from the 1 bedroom plus units, realizing that with respect to the market rate or with respect to the affordable apartments, there is the potential that single parents and others, may be attracted to the development or may reside at the development, and there is a potential for students. We agree with that, so we at RKG applied a separate metric to those units and came up with an estimate of 36 students in total, a little bit more, 6 more than the report. As we noted earlier, there were 2 approaches. The direct approach, which estimated $228,000 in student costs, and that was based on assuming an educator salary of $110,000 and a potential need for special education at about $108,000. The other cost, and the one that we focused on, was the per student or the per pupil cost. Now, in the report, they essentially used a fully loaded cost, less Chapter 70 aid, which comes out to about $14,300 per student, and they multiplied that times the 30 students. This is one area where we take a slightly different approach than the report. In our work in other communities, we tend to look at the variable costs which means those costs that are likely to go up or down with changes in enrollment. And that doesn't include the full budget costs of the 14,000, which is less the Chapter 78. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how we came up with that number. Essentially, we looked at Mass Department elementary and secondary education data for fiscal 19, looked at the following sectors of variable costs: leadership, teachers, online services, instructional materials, etc. At about $16 million, divided it by the students, and came up with an estimate of $11,314 per student, which is what we applied in our analysis. So, not to go back to that original slide on the table, but to comment from it, the costs in the Frugeri analysis were rounded about $430,000. The costs in RKG's are $407,000, which reflects a lower per student cost, but also includes 6 more students than in the report. In our discussions with the school representatives, and in the discussions that Frugeri had and put in the report, they indicated that there was capacity within the school system to handle an additional 30, give or take, students, with the caveat if they were all grade 2 or 3, then that may not be the issue. But the reasonable assumption is that they would be distributed across several grade levels. Next slide, please. The town had also asked RKG to consider an alternative development option. Essentially, what if the project were smaller in size? And we looked at a hypothetical project of 120 units as opposed to 157 units. What we did is we kept all of the metrics the same. Everything was anchored to a per unit cost. So the valuation comes down to 120 units. The taxes reflects an assessed value on 120 units. And then each of the respective costs, police, fire, and other, is a reflection of a per unit cost. So the original model developed an estimate for 157 units, and we said, well, here's our baseline. Let's say it's 5, just for argument's sake. And we're going to multiply that by 120 units as opposed to the 157. And under this hypothetical situation, there's still an estimated net positive fiscal impact of about $103,000. Next slide, please. So the concluding remarks, and then to pick up on some of the things that I said I'd discuss later, is that the report and RKG consider that based on the analysis and the metrics that we used, it would result in a net positive fiscal impact to the town, realizing that that is based on 2 very important variables. One is the final valuation of the property. Now, as we mentioned earlier, based on the $44 million estimate of value in the report, that's about $281,000 a unit, which is not unreasonable, but tends to be towards the high end of our experiences. We discussed this with the assessor and concurred that the final, the real, if you will, estimate of value will be developed by the assessor as the complex is built, stabilized, and an income approach can be used to establishing a value, as opposed to the estimate in the report, which in part reflects market research and assumed rent levels on Frugeri's part, and may reflect construction or costs. And the other issue is the resulting number of school children. They could be higher, they could be lower, but the estimate that's in the report appears reasonable for what we know now. So in summary, depending on how those 2 metrics may change, it is conceivable that the project would present less of a positive impact. And we'll go with 2 examples here. if we assume that the value per unit is perhaps $250,000 as opposed to the 281, under the analysis that RKG did using our inputs and assumptions of a positive impact of 132,000, that impact drops down to about $74,000. The other issue, which is not presented in the slides, but I'll discuss, is the chief did think that maybe 150 calls may be more appropriate. Excuse me just a minute, I've been all day. 150 calls for service may be more appropriate than the 59 that was estimated in the report. And if that is the case, based on a per call cost, that would add $43,000 to the cost for the police department to provide services. And what that does then is, under the analysis of the report, where the net fiscal impact was a positive $132,000, it drops it down to a positive $89,000. So it's still positive, but less so. And that's a result of those additional costs, and or it could reflect, as we stated before, a different valuation of the property. One thing or two things we should mention here is that a lot of this may depend exactly on to whom and how the property is marketed. With respect to school children and service calls, regardless of fire or police. It's a four-story multi-rise complex, which in our experience doesn't really tend to attract a lot of children. If, for example, it's marketed to singles and new family households prior to their family formation years, and if it's marketed to pre-retirement and retirement people, then the chance of school children being there is diminished. But we don't know that for a fact, but it's a reasonable possibility. But back to a summary comment, with minor exceptions here and there, we concur with the report that the project would result in a net positive fiscal impact for Manchester by the Sea. And Craig, if you want to add something to that's fine. Otherwise, I guess I will throw it back to you. And if we're doing questions now, you just let me know what we need.
I'm good, Larry. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to go with the Board of Selectmen first. You have any questions for the RKG folks?
I do.
Sure.
Hi, Becky.
Okay, I actually have a number of questions. And the first one, this was actually, is there any reason why last year's tax rate was used as opposed to this year's tax rate? Does it really matter?
Well, the initial report was done, as I understand it, back in September. And so we wanted to use the same rate that was used in the report.
Okay, so
I think it'll
apples to apples.
I'm sorry, one more time?
I just said apples to apples then.
Yeah, and I noted that your tax rate has changed. It's actually gone down just a smidge. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. With the school, the school costs, you mentioned that you removed the fixed costs in taking into consideration the school costs, but don't those still factor in? And I'm not a finance person, but
well,
so I'm just.
Yes, there's still a cost to the school, but you know, something like debt service is not a cost that's going to go up with one more student or down with one less student.
Okay, thank you. When you were doing comparables for the valuations, I'm just curious, do you know where the comparables were located?
2 points on that. We at RKG did not prepare a set of comparables for the valuations, but I will note from the report that Frugeri had mentioned that he had used something like 2,900 different apartments.
Right.
Across a sampling, I think, of 11 or 12 or 13 apartment complexes.
Right.
And the concern that I had with that, and which is why I bring it up all together with respect to what the final valuation is that I didn't see where any of his comparables were in Manchester by the Sea, or particularly in North Shore communities.
Right. And that was one of what I'm getting at is, I mean, to go back to my other analogy of apples to apples, I'd like to have that. So,
well, we would too. I mean, if we can get from the developer or Frugeri either construction costs or what specific comparables and rent assumptions were made.
I'm having a really hard time hearing you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. If we could get from the applicant or from Frugeri Planning and Development, you know, what construction costs were estimated to be and or what comparables were used for the analysis, that would, I think, add a comfort level to this. Again, on a short note, I would point back to 280,000 a unit may be high. The assessor thought it may be high, but you know, we just don't know for a fact. And so along those lines, we at RKG said, well, what if it's really 250,000 a unit, which is about the average we've seen across a lot of communities.
Okay.
But doesn't necessarily reflect brand new modern stuff. I can tell you without telling you that we have worked on some recent projects, one of them in Ashland, if I recall, where the per unit costs were coming in from $280,000 to $300,000. So the range is high, and the variation is high. But even if we dropped it down to
lost you.
Sorry. Even if we dropped it down to 250,000 a unit, the net fiscal impact is positive, although it diminishes by about $50,000 or $55,000.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And so back to talking about the comparables. Would the comparables come into account in terms of police and fire as well?
I suppose that's a possibility. It would depend on the comparables with respect to 40B components. I think that in the report, in their appendix, Frugeri did highlight several apartment complexes, the number of units and the calls per year to come up with an average call per unit, which developed his estimate. Again, the potential shortcoming of all of that is I don't see where any of his sample of properties is a Manchester or North Shore property. But by the same token, they have several properties in other Massachusetts communities which have very good school systems. I point to 3 or 4 properties that he has listed here in Newton as an example.
But we don't know if some of the Newtons were some of the comparables, do we?
Well, we know that in his analysis for police calls, he used Avalon at Newton Highlands,
Okay,
Avalon at Chestnut Hill, and Arbor Point Woodland.
okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
And my last question, you had pointed out in that the percentage of affordable units, we have actually fewer, he used fewer 1-bedrooms, is that correct, in the other units than what was compared?
I don't know the answer of his mix, specifically units. I know what the developer has proposed, and I think that was offered in their presentation before the select board back in October of 2020.
Right.
And that's where they commented, and if you let me switch my screen here. Bear with me. That's not the one I want.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, just let me, lost me just a minute, but that's me.
and I'm trying to find the page I had noted this on.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. What they've analyzed here is that there'll be a total of 32 1-bedroom units, with 8 of them as affordable.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a total of 48 1-bedroom plus units, and the plus is slightly larger than a closet, but not necessarily as big as a den.
Right.
And of that, there will be 12 that are affordable. 2-bedroom units total 23, with 6 is affordable. 2-bedroom plus total 38, 10 is affordable. And 3-bedroom total 16, with 4 is affordable. So in the grand picture, 39 affordable out of 157 is 25%.
Okay.
Larry and Becky, excuse me if I can interrupt here. The analysis that he did confirms data that we've seen throughout Massachusetts that, for the most part, 1-bedrooms do not produce school-age children.
Right.
So what he only counted was the 2- and 3-bedroom units added. Because some of these are 1-bedroom plus, they essentially are 2 bedrooms that may not be a full bedroom, but particularly on the affordable side, there is room for children in these, which is why we added them back in to get a few more, 6 more kids than what he had predicted.
Okay.
I mean,
Thank you, Craig.
anecdotally, I can tell you, growing up with a single parent, I had a plus bedroom in many apartments in my childhood.
As did I. I understand that. I think there was even a drawer at one time that was employed. So, thank you.
Sure.
All done.
Thank you.
Eli, I have a question for Larry.
Yes?
Yes, Larry.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I've got one question dealing with school-age children, and that deals with the data that were presented by SLC. Did you look at that data, or did you just take the 30 students and run with it?
I took the 30 students and ran with it and adjusted it based on the 1-bedroom plus.
Okay, understood. When we had reviewed the submission a couple of months or so ago, there was a mathematical error or a typo in the basic data. Or let's see, which one is it? The Ashland Apartments, Cirrus Apartments. And my best guess is that the number of students was seriously underreported because the SAC ratio seemed to be kind of in line with the other places. But if you did the math in terms of the number of students divided by the number of 2- and 3-bedrooms, the math didn't work out.
John, if I can interrupt on that, I'm working in Ashland right now.
Okay.
And I was just reported by the planning director to me this afternoon, in fact, that there's 36 children, school-age children, enrolled in the school department from 398 apartments that are there. And those are mostly, they're 1- and 2-bedroom apartments.
All right, the numbers here are 40 for 249. I mean, so these numbers aren't that far off, but the ratio that is quoted there is quite a bit off. But if you're saying that student count is what it is, we're still going with the 30 students then. And it's just
the Cirrus apartment complex?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, Craig and I both worked on that. And I think at the time I spoke with him, it was 39, so it's gone up one.
Okay,
It's 36
all right.
now.
But the school age children ratio that they produced on that is a lot different than what is shown. It shows 0.38, but 40 divided by 249 is not 0.38. It's a lot lower.
Well, okay, then the number is by default higher than it should be, but let's not go with that because
Yeah. No, then the 30 students is still an okay approximation.
Yeah, and these school-age children ratios, John, are pretty consistent around the state. There are exceptions. There are some older apartments, some of the older Avalon apartments, which are larger than the others that have 2 and 3 bedrooms. In places like Lexington and Newton and Bedford that are having slightly higher ratios. But they also reflect a different demographic that lives in that area. And also, some of them also reflect different management styles. You know, there are apartments that advertise first thing, you know, children-friendly, big playgrounds, all those kinds of things. They have a different number than others that are primarily marketed towards either single people or empty nesters. And so it varies across the board. But these ratios that Fougere used that we're confirming are pretty much in the ballpark of what we've seen elsewhere.
Okay, well, Ashland would be lower. Most of those ratios for student-age children were in the 0.3, 0.4 range.
Yeah, I think
you're down around 0.15, 0.2.
Yeah. Right, but that is correct. I think 1.16, or as you mentioned. But
yes.
Also, in our approach on all of these, and then our discussions with the school superintendent and the finance director, I don't want to say the goal, but the desire is to err conservatively, meaning not to overstate the potential positive and not to understate the potential negative. So that 30 would still be a reasonable estimate.
Yes. No, in your comments, you said in general, there are fewer students that show up than what the models have produced.
Right, and we, as Craig said, I mean, we've worked in other communities and we've seen databases with per student metrics. They're similar to this, maybe a little bit lower, but you know, also with some of the other ones we've seen, I can't tell you that they're heavy with North Shore communities. So again, there's that caveat.
Okay. The critical issue is always the distribution, the age distribution of the children that show up.
Right, and as the school pointed out, I mean, unless everybody comes in with a second and third grader, the school has the capacity for that.
Yep. Thank you.
Sure.
Ann or Jeff?
I have a couple of questions. Thank you for your presentation and your analysis.
Sure.
In the area of the school calculation of cost, I don't recall whether Fougere used debt in his school cost calculation. My recollection is that he did not.
Well, he used 2 components, or he approached it from 2 different benchmarks. One is, from the way it's presented in the report, is direct conversations with school superintendent and finance director, where they commented that it's possible that an additional educator would need to be hired, and that was estimated at an annual salary of $110,000. And then also there may be the potential of a special needs student, which would add another $108,000, and that was the low end. On the high end, what was done in the report and from the report is Fougere looked at the net school spending data as reported to the state in the 2018 regional district, and found that from the Mass Department of Education, and found that cost to be $16,469 per student. And from that, he backed out the Chapter 78 of about $2,100 to come down to his estimate of $14,328. So that's still a very aggressive cost, in so much, in my opinion, that it includes what would be fixed costs and not necessarily incremental or variable costs. As we noted, we looked at the Mass Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and determined the cost of about $11,315, if I recall correctly, which is a lower cost, but we applied it to a higher base of students. But both his high cost approach and our RKG's more or less standard way of looking at this are based on per pupil costs.
So what, I'm not clear on what you left out that led to a $3,000 per student difference.
We left out what we thought would be fixed costs, such as debt service. The cost of the debt service is not going to increase with another student. We included those types of costs that we thought would either go up or down with student enrollment. And those included costs for instructional leadership, teachers, teacher services, etc.
Yep.
And that came out, and now we're looking at about $16 million.
So you're saying that Fougere did include debt costs?
Fougere included the full load costs in his estimate.
Okay.
And what he backed out of it was the Chapter 70 reimbursement.
Okay. My second question is, this is a $44 million valued project.
That initially, yes.
Okay. And I understand that there's differences between how that might be valued and that their 281 may be higher than the 250 that you're suggesting. But let's just take it at 44 million for a second. There seems to be roughly 100K in positive revenue against the costs of having this project come into the town. That's about 0.2%. Is that typical of a project of this size to have the ratio of 100K to a 44 million project?
I'd have to go back through and reconcile other projects we've worked on. I don't want to guess at an answer for that. Craig may know something more off the top of his head than I do.
Jeff, let me basically put it, the $44 million is looking at the total value based upon the market value of the project. The costs that we're looking at, the net fiscal impacts, are on an annual basis. It's basically the annual tax revenue less the annual municipal service costs. So they're really they're actually apples and oranges when you're looking at it. The fact that it's a residential project is, come on. Oops, somebody's talking. The fact that it's a residential project and it's positive because of that value that's there, I think is not atypical with the other projects, other residential projects, both 40Bs and regular market rate projects around. Market rate apartments tend to be fiscally positive. The 40B component tends to bring that down because they're only valued at about half the $280,000 per unit, because ultimately when it gets assessed on an income basis, the income from those is lower, the revenue is lower, and hence their assessed value is going to be lower. Yeah. But overall, if it was a $44 million office building, it would be much, much more positive for the most part. But still, we believe, and as Fougere found out, that it is going to be, $100,000 a year. It's positive. Is it a huge number? No. but it is still positive. And even if you take some of the assumptions that we made, as Larry did, and look at a worst case scenario, more kids or lower valued, it's still going to come out to be marginally positive year over year.
The issue that I'm raising is, and I understand that I'm confounding my fruits here, but the issue that I'm raising is that margin of 100K, and the lowest margin that you gave was 74K, gets totally wiped out or gets close to wiped out if we have one out-of-district special needs student that comes out of this project. There are variables here in terms of the education factors that we can look at the averages, we can look at the aggregate, but when we start to think about one individual student who has a special need that leads to an out-of-district program, those typically run between $80,000 and $120,000. So I was concerned about whether that marginal value of this project, that is 100K a year, which sounds pretty good, is typical of other projects. And that was the basis of my question.
And my answer is yes.
So we're looking at those kinds of numbers in other communities that are doing these projects.
Correct.
Thank you.
And any questions?
Not now.
All right, so it's 7:25. We are behind schedule, but I know that there are a lot of people who are interested in this topic. I'm going to allow a total of about 10 or 15 minutes of questions from the public for anybody who has questions at this point for this particular consultant. And I'm going to ask that everybody restrict themselves to a minute or two per person. Ask one question apiece for now, and we're not going to get into discussions back and forth. Just ask a question and see if we can get some answers. All right, first up is Sandy. Sandy, if you can unmute yourself and state your full name and your address, and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is Sandy Rogers, 82 Old Essex Road. Was an analysis done of including any one-time costs, or is this just annual costs? Because some of the feedback that we were getting earlier, there might be a need to spend $1 million on an appropriate fire engine because we don't have an appropriate fire engine for this kind of complex. We need to hire crossing guards, redo some intersections. Even if we get them to pay some of the infrastructure to go across the road, do we need to upgrade any certain pumps or anything to handle the load? Like, there seems to be very little about any of those impacts, even if they get streamed through a certain amount of years of taxation.
Well, there were a couple of issues. One is that the report did note that there would be a one-time revenue stream of building permit fees, but that is not an ongoing revenue stream to the general fund, and typically that is used to pay for the costs of inspections and other town services while the project is being built. The report also noted that there be on-site septic such that sewer would not be an issue, and that the occupants and the tenants would be paying regular water rates and hookup fees, which is all part of the cost of maintaining that service. Now, when I spoke with DPW, they did note that so long as everything is on site with respect to septic, then that's fine. There's not really a cost with that. But Charles, Chuck, if he prefers to be called, Chuck Dam did also state that, you know, if in fact the sanctuary needed to extend lines and or extend septic, that he would anticipate that to be a cost borne by them.
But nothing else, like from additional fire trucks or crossing guards or new lights that need to be put in or anything else. None of that was calculated here, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, Sarah Melish is next.
Yes, so my question is that Manchester has a highly rated school system. And I'm wondering if when you looked at the number of potential students, whether you looked at the existing number of students per residential unit, because I believe it's higher than what the calculations have considered.
We did not look at that. We did speak with the school superintendent and the finance director and asked if they had metrics on per students for apartments like this. And since they're few and far between, they didn't. I mean, the student counts that we have, I'm assuming in Manchester, reflect a largely owner-occupied community, which would have a tendency to have more school-aged children than a renter-occupied development of 4 stories. But the direct answer is no. We did not use a town-wide metric for students per residence.
Mr. Engler, did you have a comment?
Did. I appreciate Larry and Craig's analysis. I don't mean to put you on the spot because I know you didn't look at this, but based on your experience and off the top of your head, how would you say the fiscal impact would be if there was a 120 unit project with all 2 and 3 bedroom units?
Well, if we're going to apply the same metric on a per student basis, it would, if you give me a minute, I can come up with a calculation of that. Bear with me.
Jeff, let me jump in and say if it's all just 2 and 3 bedroom units, it's going to have probably a little bit higher metric in terms of the number of school-age children. The total units will be smaller. You know, I without doing a calculation, and maybe Larry will be able to do that. It looks like to me it's going to come out. It's going to lower the overall net fiscal impact, but it'll still be probably slightly positive or a break even at best.
Thank you.
On 120 units, yeah, it's squeaking at barely positive.
All right. Other people with questions on this part of the presentation? All right, then I think what we'll do is move on, Greg, to the next presentation. And Greg, you're muted.
Yep, sorry. Right. So next up we have Gary Hebert. He's with Stantec Consulting, and he will walk us through his review of the traffic study. And I'll turn it over to Gary and get his presentation up on the screen here as well.
And Larry and Craig, are you staying on for a bit, or are you planning on heading out at this point?
I'm starving unless you need me to stay on.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you very much.
Oh.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm looking for it, Gary.
Looking to see if you're going to put up the presentation or.
Yep, here it comes.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, Greg. For the record, my name is Gary Hebert, and I'm a consulting engineer with Stantec. And I wanted to go through several slides that covers the report that I submitted on January 11th, 2021, which addressed the traffic, parking, and circulation and access issues related to the site. Next slide, please.
Why isn't it not advancing? Sorry. There we go.
Okay, great, thank you. Just to get an understanding of where we are relative to the town of Manchester by the Sea, the site is located roughly 2 miles from the village core area, just north of exit 15 or Route 128. And between to the west is exit 16 near Pine Street. And the site is serviced by Tulane Road, School Street, which provides access down into the core area. And the access is proposed via a cul-de-sac. So with that, I just wanted to just give you the rough regional setting of the site. Next slide, please. What did we do? Well, for this effort, we reviewed the traffic impact assessment prepared by Vanessa Associates, Inc., dated September 20th, and looked at the site access features related to traffic access, parking, and circulation prepared for a meeting that was presented to the Selectmen on October 2020. I did perform a site visit on December the 29th. It was clearly not a normal time between school vacation and whatnot. And I was aware of that during the visit, and am familiar enough with Manchester to know its busy traffic patterns during the summer months. And I also coordinated with the traffic consultant, Vanessa Associates, and spoke with the fire chief and the town on access questions, and tried to look at as much information as we had on the town's website for background information and comments pertaining to access, parking, and site circulation. As I mentioned, I prepared the letter on the 11th and tonight's virtual meeting. There will be follow-up to this relative to a next task, which is to look at specifically what the impacts of 120 units versus 157 units would be. But at this point, I just want to go through some of the findings with the initial traffic impact assessment. First of all, this gives a localized presentation of the 4 intersections that were looked at with the site. The on and off ramps to Route 128, the site driveway, and an intersection with Atwater Avenue, which is very close to this site driveway. I tried to place in the site plan as best as I could to show relatively to the rest of the streets in the area what its circulation system is going to kind of look like. This kind of shows you what's going on. There's a lot of wetlands near the site, a lot of forested area near the site, and it's high up in the air, which we'll get to a little bit because it has issues pertaining to access. Next slide, please. The first thing that's always done in a traffic impact study is to look at what kind of traffic it's actually going to generate over 24-hour and during the morning and evening peak hours, which tend to be the worst peak hours for traffic. A site like this, the VAI study showed that they were going to generate on average 427 to 420 in and out trips on a daily basis, 24 hours. During the morning peak hour, a total of 53 trips, which I agree with that assessment, of which most would be out, 39 out, 14 in, and in the afternoon, 68 total trips, which is the peak hour of the day, 41 in and 27 out. I purposely wanted to go in the peak hour of the afternoon, but again, since the volumes that I saw were not typical, I don't really believe that's normal conditions for the area. But it was helpful in getting a lot of insight for the site. Next slide, please. Also for the study, you look at, that's typical for the traffic engineer to look at the distribution of site-generated traffic that's generated only by the site and where it will go. In this case, they expect most of the traffic to go southbound on Route 128, about 30% to go towards the village area, and 127 to the south. That might be toward parts of Beverly and places like that. 3% up to the north towards Gloucester, 3% on Atwater Avenue, and 4% north on School Street coming out of the site driveway. That's a reasonable estimate based on the trip distribution information that I had available from the study, and it's typically done using census journey to work data, and that's appropriate. So we have no problems with that particular estimate was made for the study. Next slide, please. Site distance measurements. Out the site, it's very clear that there's excellent site distances in both directions coming out of the future site drive. Just wanted to show you a couple pictures there that show roughly what you're looking at when you're looking to the south on School Street and looking to the north on School Street. And you can see there's unpaved shoulders on the side of the road on both sides of the road. And you have School Street itself is about, I believe it's 26 feet wide. I think it's 12 and 2-foot shoulders on either side of the center line, looking east and west. So next slide. So it's important to understand that School Street is a higher speed road, though. When we did the sightline measurements, we're looking at whether or not they met the 45-mile-per-hour speed, and they did well exceed that. So that's important. So what are the major traffic analysis findings? Well, the study area that was looked at is reasonable from my perspective. It did address the major intersections that were going to be affected by this site, including the two interchange exits, the northbound, southbound exit at School Street from exit 15, and to the intersection of Atwater plus a site driveway. Those are typical for a development this size to be evaluating, so I had no problem with that particular methodology for selecting those intersections. The trip distribution, generation, future travel forecasts, all those were done reasonably the way that we would normally do them for all traffic studies that we do using the Institute of Transportation Engineer and as I mentioned before, the trip distribution factors based on journey to work data from census. The estimates of the existing and peak hour operations were done with widely accepted guidelines. Now, these guidelines have been shifted a little bit during the pandemic because they had to increase the volumes that were actually counted in July of last year by upwards of 30% to account for the lower than usual traffic due to the governor's mandate for trip reductions. And they did increase those volumes. And since they did take their counts during the month of July, which is typically a higher month for Manchester, it stands to reason that their trip generation estimates reasonably in the ballpark. It's hard for me to tell because I didn't see normal conditions, but I believe they're reasonably accurate for what was known in the background traffic, the MassDOT historical data, and so forth. Traffic operations will be similar with and without this development. At the three intersections are important, and that's important to understand because in the case of the exits with 128, there is some congestion that was observed for both, that was found for both existing conditions and future conditions with or without this development. And it's something that should be addressed whether or not this development moves forward. Now, except for the optional left turn bypass northbound on School Street, which is just a short area of widening out School Street a little bit, if it works from an environmental perspective. And I wouldn't push it, but I'm suggesting that in some cases, because of the speeds out there, there have been incidences of rear end collisions increasing when you have a location that's suddenly going from 45 to something that's not used to being there. In this case, it would take some time for people to get used to it. Now, theoretically, if people signal far enough in advance, it's not a problem, but it will mean that occasionally traffic following traffic turning left into the site will have to slow down for this passing. And what we'd like to do is think about the possibility of using some of that shoulder to provide a possibility for traffic to slowly bypass on the right if someone's waiting to turn left, but not encourage that. I'd rather see people slow down in this area as much as possible. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay. The cul-de-sac issue is, in my opinion, a significant issue with this particular site. What's proposed is a long curvilinear, relatively steep driveway. By relatively steep, it's not It doesn't violate the peak of local streets, which is normally guided by 8%, but it is a steep road and it will not be pedestrian or bike friendly because of the steepness of the road, the way it's going to work. So the adequacy of the median driveway design features should be confirmed by some kind of a drawing showing the turning radii envelopes, whether it's auto turn or something like that, to show how these will work, especially when the thought is that maybe vehicles entering would change direction. Again, I don't think it's a good idea for vehicles to change direction on a one-way in each direction between a median when you have not the best sight lines to deal with along that side, unless you've got some kind of control. But that said, I think the geometry of the site driveway needs to be confirmed. Guidance in many national publications discourage overly long cul-de-sacs. It's not unusual. Zoning codes in more than 2/3 of Massachusetts communities do not permit new cul-de-sacs exceeding 600 feet in length. Manchester's rule happens to be 500, but a lot of communities, it's 500, 600, and even you can go up as high as 1,000, but usually those are combined with maximum number of units that are less than a handful. Excessively long cul-de-sacs generally produce undesirable multimodal transportation connections and can be detrimental to emergency access in the event of road blockage of any sort. So as a rule, I think it's a good idea if you're going to have a cul-de-sac to make sure that it works well and that the access that's being provided is going to be sufficient. So as a rule, in this case, it certainly would seem that it makes a lot of sense to think about the possibility of considering some kind of an additional route, if you can do it, for emergency access only, and maybe pedestrian access to the trail. But again, I'm only throwing that out there as one thing that might be considered, but I understand the environmental implications of something like that. But it's an important issue to think about how this site is going to be served in the long term. Next slide, please. The things that were most striking about this particular site driveway is about 40 to 45% of the site will be graded at least 6.5% or steeper, up to 7.5% in terms of grades. That's a long stretch for pedestrians and bicyclists to be comfortable riding in, especially less experienced ones. More experienced ones, not so much, but less experienced ones for sure. Approximately 700 feet of continuous field driveway will average 7%, and that's important. 3 of the driveways curve radii are 62.5, 65, and 105 feet. The one toward the one towards the front is School Street. That's going to be the sharpest one, and then again, I think that's 62.5 feet. So its sight line may be less than 100 feet, depending on what the sight lines will look like from there. And it's a good idea to have enough sight line to be able to see somebody that might happen to be in the road going in the uphill direction from that point. Same with the other curves in the area. I recognize the difficulty of developing this site. It's a very difficult site from a topographical perspective, but the driveway itself, design speed will likely be in the range of 10 miles per hour, which would mean you'd have to have some kind of signage saying there's a 10-mile-an-hour speed limit, and maybe even some kind of ways to deter speeding going down the driveway without causing further problems. But that's something for the applicant to think about. Next slide, please. All right, from a site design perspective, we also looked at the proposed parking layout in the site. And given the proposed number of units, we do believe there's going to be enough spaces at 247 spaces, should be adequate. In fact, when we looked at the number of bedrooms and did the Institute of Transportation Engineers parking generation estimates, we found that it's probably closer to 185 or 188 spaces in peak demands. That's the overnight demand for development like that for the number of bedrooms that's proposed. But given the high number of units, if economically feasible, consider a loop road or additional emergency vehicle access. And I'll be quite honest with you, I see very difficulty in doing either of those, but certainly it's very important to make sure that access road functions safely and efficiently in the long term. Circulation safety concerns about the dead end include the parking bays that are in 5 of the aisles, which you can see in orange here, the 5 locations that have dead end parking bays, which is normally not a good thing in a parking garage because you like to be able to get people out of areas in case they've driven in and those spaces are occupied, they have to back down, which is hazardous for people who might be behind them. The other thing is the backing area in a few spaces on the north end and the south end, about 4 spaces, had no real backing area. And it's generally a good idea to provide some sort of backing area to allow for people to back up about 6 feet so they can turn and get out of the bay. The column obstructions, there's a lot of columns in there. I think there's like roughly 79 to 80. You have to be very careful around those columns. In most cases, you like to provide a good 2.5 feet of which at least 2 feet, a couple of feet on either side of the columns to allow for additional space beyond what you would normally use for that. So that's the next thing. And next, did you move up the next slide? Sorry. So it's important to think about the possibility of providing additional space if you can, and cleaning up those rows where the dead ends occurs to eliminate as many of those as possible. Next slide, please. Walking, biking, and trail connections. This is important because, as you know, there's important trails right next to the site maintained by the Manchester Essex Conservation Trust trail system. And the site actually seems to overlap on some of the trails that you see on the site plans. And I know it's private property and they can do what's appropriate, but it is important to understand that those connections to the trails should be identified, and impacts on existing trails, where they are going to be, so that people understand what's going to happen when this site develops, what's going to happen to those trail connections. Ideally, you would certainly want to have a trail connection. And as I mentioned, if it was possible, and you could do it without dealing with, without having to fill any wetlands or anything like that, another access along the trail only used for emergency and only to allow for pedestrians and bicyclists from the site to get to the trail, and vice versa, people using the trail to get to the site. It would be something to consider. Steep grades and the curvilinear geometric features of the site driveway will not be bike friendly or pedestrian friendly. That's just no 2 ways about it. It's important to understand that. As I said, people who want to ride their bikes down will have to be experienced riders and understand that the grade challenges with that steep downgrade and upgrade will present to them when they're accessing the site. Pedestrians, and again, they have to deal with these sharp curves on the site driveway, which affects the impacts of drivers as they're coming toward those curves to be able to see anyone who's walking on the trail. So the last thing is a shuttle transit service. I want to mention this because the applicant did propose a shuttle stop on the site, which is a good thing, next to the circular end of the cul-de-sac. In coordination with the town, they should pursue the type, service level, and funding options for either a shuttle or a fixed route service as a way to mitigate potential parking impacts on the village core area. And use of the shuttles and van carpool services to access the core area will reduce site-related traffic impacts in the absence of good bicycle pedestrian access. And there are things that could be done to enhance those accessibility things, like a sidewalk, for example, but we recognize that a sidewalk be difficult to install because you must make it ADA compliant, and it's difficult to do that in those steep grade situations. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess I can go to the extra slides if you want. One of the things that I mentioned before I go on to the discussion was that the interchange accesses could be considered both signalized or done another way to a roundabout configuration. And I think I'll just show the extra slides if you want, going down a little bit. They're down there, I think. Oops, sorry. There you go. Okay, this is the intersection of the exit southbound ramp and what a potential roundabout might look like at that ramp if you were to install it at some point in the future in lieu of a traffic signal, just something to look at. And we understand that VAI plan to look at options for the interchange in the future. And I suggested that this might be something to look at in addition to signalization, because sometimes they can prove to be safer and more efficient and can allow for some kind of pedestrian flows, which I've shown in kind of the orange lines here, potential pedestrian flows along School Street, that if in the future there's a sidewalk might be constructed on School Street, that would be something to consider. Next slide, please. This is the last one on the northbound off-ramp, similar situation, only you have to incorporate Mill Street into it and provide some kind of a access across School Street to get them out of there, get the Mill Street folks out of there. And also I understand there's a future church development parcel which might be able to access something directly from that site. So just a thought. In any event, that concludes the formal part of the presentation. I'll be glad to answer any questions that the board or
I should have started these earlier, but hey, can't do everything perfectly in life.
go
All
back.
right, same drill, board members. Board members first, and then we'll take some questions from the public.
I have questions, of course.
Go ahead, Becky.
Not a lot actually, but do you happen to know what the town zoning is regarding grades and emergency vehicles?
Yes, I do. You gotta have less than 6% grade for 120 units. I know that. That's the guideline. Right.
Thank you.
That number of units.
Then what are edge speed reduction markings?
Pardon?
What are edge speed reduction markings?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I'll have to explain that. Some time ago, when I was doing a project, we developed, it's in accordance with the manual and uniform traffic control devices. They're actually speed reduction markings are little white lines on the edge of the road, maybe about a foot or so square, and they maybe a couple feet actually, emanating from the side of the road, and they progressively get closer and closer together as you're going downhill. So that what it does is it gives the optical illusion you're speeding up even though you're actually slowing down. So it's an attempt to get motorists to slow down when they're going downhill. That's what speed reduction marking.
Interesting.
Okay.
Thank you. And is there any specific degree of pitch guidelines for in terms of ADA compliant sidewalks?
Yes.
And
you can.
What is that?
Well, for short lengths you can exceed 5%, but it's normally you have to go 5% is the maximum that they like to see on any kind of a ADA normal guideline. For short stretches you can exceed that, but you have to have leveling areas and so on in order to get around that. So it is very difficult. So once you've got a road that's generally in the range of 5 to 7 to 7.5%, it's very difficult to get an ADA compliant, which I'm sure why no sidewalk was proposed along this driveway.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I learned a lot there and appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All done.
John, Jeff, or Ann?
Yes, got a question, Gary.
Yes.
Yep.
Can you comment about the access road and the divider that is at least currently planned and whether that's an advisable structure to have? There are certain safety factors that I guess work in both directions here. Keeping cars apart, but it also confines you to one side in the event that you need to get to the other side. So I'm interested in what your thoughts are and the width at which that road is currently designed and what you think it should be.
Well, it's very tricky because there's so many factors at play here. One is environmental, as you know, so the narrowest you can make it is the best solution in most cases relative to what is operationally acceptable. I would probably learn a lot more about what the exact proper one is for this when I'm looking at the auto turn designs that would show exactly where vehicles are going to track, especially the larger vehicles, the largest vehicles, because I don't want to have the largest vehicles over tracking into the opposite lane of traffic in a normal flow. Now, in an emergency condition, the nice thing about not having a median is if someone is happen to be up against the median and it, for whatever reason, they could block that exit almost entirely. We normally recommend no less than 16 feet for each side of a median because of that. Now that does not account for turning roadways. So when you turn a roadway, you make it, you change geometry, you actually have to go a little wider because at that point you need more area to go around something. So that's why these things need to be ferreted out when you look at the detailed sketches of how the largest vehicles are going to actually access this site. In broad terms, I would say the town's guidance of 34 feet for a minimum width of 120 units is a reasonable strategy. It's not, it's something you can live with. It's rather conservative. I've seen them go down as low as 22 to 24 feet to preserve wetlands and green space. But again, most times you got to be careful about that relative to sight lines and relative to blockages and those sorts of things related to trees falling on the road. So this is a very complicated situation, but I think that I would take those two of those dividers and not necessarily consider them. I prefer do one towards the first 100 feet of the driveway where it's leveled out and truncate it there and try to do whatever slowing mechanisms I could use for the rest of the street to keep traffic moving slowly but comfortably along the site driveway. Again, at 10 miles per hour is the kind of speed we're trying to get at. So I would have speed feedback signs or something on the site driveway to make sure people travel at the speed they're supposed to. Another thing I want to mention, and I think it's important to understand that last 100 feet that's leveled off, it's very important to maintain that ice-free, because in the winter, if you've got an icing situation, you got to make sure that particular part has enough traction to get people come full and complete stop at the intersection with School Street, a high-speed street. So it might be important to consider some way to make sure that roadway will have the traction at all times during the winter months, even during sharp conditions. So those are things I'd like to mention as far as the site driveway. There are definitely ways to enhance it a little bit. I wouldn't necessarily have the median as long as it is.
Thank you.
You all set, John?
I am.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It's been very helpful, particularly the slides about the roundabouts. I had a question concerning assumptions of traffic flow.
Okay.
And you're making the assumption that in the summertime we have more traffic. But during the school year, excuse me, during the school year, there is a very significant traffic congestion that occurs between the hours of about 7:15 in the morning and 8:30 in the morning on School Street, backing up all the way to 128 and across 128 at times, with traffic coming towards the schools, which is constrained by the stop sign at Pleasant Street.
I'm going to turn them off for a minute. Okay,
And-
so this is Mike DeRosa's.
Could you please mute
plan.
yourself? We're in the middle of talking about something right now. Thank you. So there's a very significant traffic congestion that occurs backed up at the stop sign at School and Pleasant all the way out to 128. And I'm wondering about the assumptions that were made. I know that you said, okay, I know there's more traffic when school's in session, but you wouldn't even see it now because the high school is not in session. It's running remotely. It's about to start, I believe, mid-month here. to go back into classroom session, but right now it's not.
Okay.
So I have concerns about that because that's a very significant congestion period. And it goes off onto Lincoln Street towards the high school and towards the elementary school.
Okay.
And it breaks at around 7:45 for a little bit until the traffic towards the elementary school picks up. But were those assumptions brought into the analysis that you were doing?
Well, I didn't do the analysis. I just reviewed the analysis. Okay, I understand that. I reviewed it from the standpoint of whether or not it made sense from a typical factors. Now, whenever there are issues like schools and this sort of thing that go into play, there's always room for checking into issues that have arisen because of that. Now, you're suggesting this backup on School Street heading toward Pleasant Street sometimes backs up beyond the interchange and in the morning and
back to the interchange.
Back to the interchange, okay. And I guess I'd want to I defer to Vanessa Associates to see whether or not they looked at that aspect of it.
I don't believe that they did because they did their analysis, I believe, in July.
Yes, that's correct. They did definitely do it in July. So
and it wouldn't have mattered anyway because the schools were shut down.
Right. Well, the only thing I can say is that the thing about schools, and it's very common in many communities, is that the congestion tends to be spot. It curves usually for about 45 minutes in the morning and sometimes half an hour to 45 minutes in the afternoon. That's the way it normally occurs. I don't know that I would see that this is going to have a significant impact on what their results show that there is congestion here. Now, there is also congestion at Pleasant Street, but relative to what could be done about Pleasant Street, adding this development's traffic to that is not going to make that much of a difference based on what I understand the distribution of traffic to be.
You said, but you did say that 30% of the traffic would be headed towards the village.
That's correct.
Either to go to Beverly or to go to the commuter rail.
Now think about that for a second. 30% of the traffic, 30% of, let's see, I'm going to try to figure this out as best I can. In the morning, okay, 30% of 30 vehicles is about going toward the village, okay, is, let's see, is nine trips toward the village in the morning. Again, that's in peak hour.
You're saying 30%, 30 vehicles is the entire flow out of the complex in the
During
morning?
the morning peak hour, yes. In the morning peak hour for that.
30 vehicles leaving that complex in the morning.
Correct. 30, well, it's not my saying, it's the Institute of Transportation Engineers based on studies around whatever, using this around the country and using the guidelines specific. It's not going to be the same number of units that you would expect it to be. Certainly, I've got to apologize for a second. I'm looking at the 20% reduction numbers, 30, but it would be more like, sorry, let's see here. Everything at once, a lot of figures to remember.
36.
Yes. 39 out, sorry, 39 out. So 30% of 39, whatever that number is, would be the number that would be headed toward the village in the morning peak hour. And so the total trips generated in the morning peak hour would be 53 for the site for the 157 units. That's because all sites don't go out at the same time. They go out at different hours. They spread out over time, and that's very common.
And what's the morning peak hour in those analyses?
Whatever the site peak is, I don't have that right off the top of my head. I have the study open, but I think it's probably in the range of 7 to 8, but I'd have to look.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Engler, I do see that you've got your hand raised, and I will allow you to make a comment here.
Thank you, Mr. Hebert. I appreciate your analysis. It's been a while since had the pleasure of working with you. Just a couple things. One, we did do an auto turn analysis that I believe was submitted to the town for the record. We sat with the fire chief and got the specs for the largest truck in the town and prepared a plan to show how that truck can easily navigate through the site. We'll make sure, I've already texted my team to make sure that you and the town have that plan, but it was prepared quite some time ago. And then secondly, and kind of importantly, I mean, relative to your written analysis, I don't think my traffic engineer, who you know, or me as the applicant, really had any issue, and we're prepared to make changes to the entryway. If you don't like the median and you want it all paved, we would do that. So I think my comment to the Board of Selectmen is we're receptive to your peer reviewers' recommendations in his written report. As the board, I think, recognizes, we cannot provide a second means of egress to the site. We can't do it for wetlands reasons and other environmental reasons, topography. So we've looked very closely at the driveway entrance and how the roadway meanders up to the property. So our objective is to make that the best possible entryway we can, understanding the conditions. Likewise, as Mr. Hebert accurately concluded, not only are we not going to provide a sidewalk because of the grade, there's no sidewalk on School Street. So, you know, there's no connectivity anywhere for pedestrians. Would be happy to do connectivity to the trust's land abutting us, but I know they don't want that. But if the board wanted us to show a plan that has some pedestrian connectivity onto the adjacent property, we would be happy to do that. But I just wanted to say we recognize the inherent constraints, and our objective is to make it as safe and operable as possible, which we think we have. We can continue to work with Mr. Hebert and the town on that. But I've done lots of 40Bs that have longer one-way entrances than this, and it's not, you know, there's not a prohibition against it. So I just wanted to make that clear. So thank you. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
All right. And if you have any questions, you can ask them, and then I'm going to go to members of the public. And Ashley, yes, I've seen your hand up for a while. I've got you here.
Sorry, I've been having computer problems. It is, I am having trouble understanding why the number of trips that is so low, is estimated to be so low. Oh, excuse me, I've now got another computer problem. It is fairly typical in Manchester for each kid to be delivered to school by car, and even at 30 kids, 56 trips means that only 26 people are going to work. I don't see how that number is so low.
I can't explain that beyond the fact that it's been studied in many places, and that's based on the Institute of Transportation Engineers, which is what we all use in figuring out what the trips are going to be. And again, if people travel at different times, and they aren't necessarily all traveling in the peak hour, they might be traveling in the peak period, but the peak period sometimes goes between 6 and 9:30 a.m. in the morning. So that's why the numbers aren't exactly equal to the total number of units in this kind of situation. So again, I don't make that up, and they don't make it up. We just base it on the information that's collected and try to evaluate things on the same playing field.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead and take some questions from the members of the public now. Ashley, go ahead and unmute yourself and state your full name for the record.
Hi, Ashley Oaks, 7 North Street in Manchester. And Gary, I appreciated your work, particularly on the life safety and bringing that up. And Jeff Engler, thank you for joining. It's great to be able to have you here and hear how receptive you will be to feedback on the road, particularly relative to the life safety issue. I took some time and read through the majority of the housing appeals on the state website. And in many instances, they do discuss life safety and, you know, length of road. And Jeff, you're right, often it is waived. However, there is one case which is frequently cited in life safety concerns, and it is one of the few which has been upheld. It is Lexington Woods versus Waltham, 2005. And when you do a point-by-point comparison between things like grade, width, elevation between the road and the building site, the development site, lack of a pull-off on the access road. In this proposed site, there are 157 units. In this other site where the state ruled in favor of the town over the concerns of life safety, there were only 36 units. And this hits a local nerve because 2 years ago, or I guess 1 year ago, there was an instance of a fire where at 30 University Lane in Manchester, the fire department was challenged at reaching the site in snowy conditions. Let me see, I have a quote from an article. There was a 15 to 20 minute delay for the engines to get to the scene, and firefighters had to run hoses through residents' backyards because of weather conditions and tight hilly streets in the neighborhood. Now, here we even have further concerns, which is 157 homes, a winding road that comes up at such a vertical rate, which I believe it's 7.5% in some places. And in some places you have the site so high and the road so close that very few sides of the building site can be accessed by fire equipment. And I do realize that not all sites are required to be accessed. But when you take into consideration, as the state did in their housing appeal in 2005, it is, you holistically review all of the factors of a site. And in this legal precedent, they say that the safety concerns overrode the need for local housing. And I believe that now that this has come to light, Gary, thank you for your study of these life safety issues. We have an opportunity to, and I believe John Whitten is also on the call to weigh in on this, but there's a serious liability with the site as designed. And we have an opportunity before we drag out this long process to look into these legal precedents and rethink this site. Thank you.
Ms. Oaks, I appreciate the input. You didn't ask a very specific question. You asked for broad commentary in return. And I think I'm gonna hold off on making broad commentary, let some other people give some feedback, and then we will see where we go from there. Next in line was Gary Gilbert.
Thank you, Eli, and thanks, Gary, for your presentation. Gary, I'm concerned, do you agree that removing the median strip on the access road would slow traffic down? It seems to me having that median strip makes a little parkway kind of thing. Yes, it's a steep hill, but the speeds would increase. And tandem to that, to some extent, is overflow parking for guests and such. Do you recommend having some soft shoulders? So if there's an overflow event or for whatever reason they can't all park in the garage, there's some areas where people could park on the shoulder, which would also slow down traffic on the site.
You know, as I saw the site and the layouts, it looks like it's such a steep site and the cut and fill sections are significant, such that it's going to be very difficult to do much beyond the site driveway itself. I think it's ideally great to have, you know, some kind of soft shoulders on either side. I don't know how feasible it is. I also think that if you do remove the median in certain areas, you certainly would want to strike the heck out of it. Might even want to put a very minimal surface median that kind of dictates that you should slow down. I mean, again, I haven't really thought through all the methods of how this would be done, but the reality is that there are ways to slow it down that don't necessarily involve a median and still allow for the possibility of vehicles to pass in an emergency, or you know, somebody to have some kind of refuge in an emergency. So I think that again, I have to give this more thought because I really haven't been involved in this particular project all that long. Believe it or not, only a couple weeks, but I think that there are things that can be done to slow traffic down, and the median in some cases can present a hazard, especially under slippery conditions, when people can slide into it. That's the one thing I am very concerned about. But again, it's steep grades. It's not going to be good for pedestrians and bicyclists to use it. And that I can't get away from that. That bothers me because I really like to have sites like this be pedestrian and bike accessible if possible. So losing those connections and trail connections and ability for pedestrians and bicycles to use this properly is important. And again, since we know that the shuttle bus is proposed, some kind of method to explain what that service is going to be very, very important. And sharing rides will be very important for this site. I don't know if I answered your question properly, but. Anything else?
I'm gonna assume that you got it, and if he wants to raise his hand, he will again. Next in line was Sandy.
Hi, Sandy Rogers, 82 Old Essex Road. Thank you. This sort of, in addition to what Jeffrey had brought up about the Pleasant School Street interchange, I guess I was under the impression that there would be a study of the impact to the total town. So parking downtown, traffic flow downtown, et cetera. So has that been done? Is that going to be done? Can varying scenarios be run with these numbers regarding up or down on those kinds of flows? That's my first question. The second question is, it's really good. Thank you for showing these diagrams on the roundabouts for safety reasons. If those roundabouts don't exist, would also like to know the implications of the safety for all of the traffic, the bikes, the pedestrians potentially that could be in those areas if those are not reconfigured. Thank you.
Relative to the downtown study, certainly, I will say that I've never heard of a development having to assess impacts off-site like that in a downtown area. That's a strange one for me. I understand there are impacts, but I never heard of a particular development. That's part of the job, is to figure out not only what their parking impacts are on site, but also in the downtown. That's just very unusual. Usually it's a town function to figure that out. It's something that can be figured out, but you look at it not just from one site, you look at it from who in fact is parking downtown, and what this site's contribution to it will basically be dictated by what the capacity is of those parking areas downtown. You may have a fixed capacity so that if you have no room to have these vehicles from the site, then that will dictate that this site users will not be parking downtown because there's just simply no room to park downtown, them or anybody else that goes downtown. I mean, I don't know who all goes downtown. It could be people from all over as far as I know, they're coming to Gloucester or whenever, coming down to Park if they can, or people in town existing today. Or, you know, again, it's a very difficult situation, and it's not something that would normally be looked at for a site like this. It's not something to be very usual. It's unusual to look at. And I would almost suggest that the applicant should not have to address what's going to happen in downtown Manchester. It should be something the town should address, could address for relative to the site. And I think it is studying a downtown, it's got plans to study downtown in the near future. It's something that should be done. Again, I can only give advice as far as things that might be done relative to what this site can do as it affects the evaluation of the traffic from this site. But I didn't plan on looking at it downtown, but it's certainly something that could be done by others.
Okay, and in the second question on the, you know, if these roundabouts didn't exist, what is your assessment on the safety at those kinds of intersections?
It will depend on what the future growth in traffic really is. I know one of the things that's been difficult about this study is when you look at all the factors that had to be done for the traffic, you had increased it 30% due to the pandemic. And, you know, and assuming it's average annual conditions, that 30% got carried through and increased all the way through the future conditions as part of the background traffic. And then you increase on top of that, you know, all the ramp traffic and everything else by 30%. So I don't know whether that will be realized, but I do believe there's going to be congestion at the ramp terminals, and there's only a couple ways of really dealing with it. You could do it through signals or through the roundabouts. And whether the state wants to pursue the roundabouts, I know that the applicant has agreed to prepare a study showing the options that are available at the interchanges, and hopefully that study gets passed forward into MassDOT, which can somehow get the funding to address these interchanges in the future. Because I think at some point in time, crashes will increase as the development, well, as the traffic increases, the crashes tend to increase, especially as it relates to conflicting traffic on the interchanges. So it's something that is planned, that the developer had planned to submit materials that would be helpful to get the town on the state's future projects to do, such that this is something that could be addressed by the state in the future. But certainly the applicant is not going to be driving these changes. It's most of the traffic that's there is going to be traffic that already exists in those locations and that will already exist in the future at those locations. So I think it's important to say that the applicant's traffic impacts are not going to be significant to really significantly affect safety at either of these locations. Preferably, you would like to see something like roundabouts done in the future, because they're, I believe it's a safer way to deal with it than signalization. So anyway, that's
great. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Next in line is Mr. Cross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hebert. And thank you, Selectmen, for your hard work on this complex project. Mr. Hebert, a moment ago, Mr. Engler mentioned that he has worked on other projects with long roads, even longer than this one. Can you name the 40B projects elsewhere in the state which have this combination of long road, no secondary access road, steep grade, and comparable sizing? Where are those other projects that so effectively provide to the residents a threat to their physical safety?
I can't name them. I don't know where they are. I know where some. I know there's some 40B projects proposed on cul-de-sacs. You know, but I have not seen any on this long of a cul-de-sac and with these particular conditions. So I know, but you know, maybe they have examples, but I didn't review them.
There's just nothing else comparable to this, then.
I can't find anything on my hand. I can't, no.
Thank you. Maybe Mr. Engler could respond on that. Does he know of projects that are comparably dangerous? No, he doesn't know of anything else this dangerous.
Respectfully, I think you have to direct your question to the chair, who would then call on me.
Okay.
We're going to have a conversation.
Fair enough, Mr. Engler. Mr. Engler, do you have any examples? You
Yeah,
mentioned
there's
you
a
had-
project in Westboro. And listen, admittedly, this project, yes, it has terms like adequate or comparably dangerous. That's a subjective term. And we've met with the fire chief and we've designed plenty of projects, and this is going to meet all net applicable codes. So if you want to hang your hat on an HAC case, which I'm very familiar with, that had other circumstances involved, be my guest, because the fact of the matter is Manchester is well under its 10% affordable housing criteria. That's not in dispute. And under 40B, that means that the reasons to deny or significantly condition a project have to be so overwhelming. And yes, life safety is one of those things, but based on years and years of experience in doing many, many projects, I've been involved with 15,000 units of multifamily housing in Massachusetts, dealt with every traffic engineer in the state. We feel quite confident that ultimately we'll do what Mr. Hebert has requested. We can make some changes to the roadway, but we can look at the grades somewhat, but it's going to be steep going in and out, and we're only going to have one way in and out. And that's okay, because there's lots of other projects that have had similar situations. So I don't know what else the board would like me to comment on, but the project in Westboro off the top of my head is a project that had a driveway consistent with this. It did not have the grade, but it had a long one-way in and out. Moreover, we've submitted the auto turn analysis, which shows the largest vehicles in Manchester easily navigating in and out of the site and throughout the entirety of the site.
Thanks, Mr. Engler. The question was to give an example of another site that had such a length, and you answered that. Next in line is Mr. Hall, Steve Hall.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Gary, for your presentation. I had one comment and then a question. One comment is that I noticed that this other study that you analyzed said there was no traffic going from this development to School Street to Mill Street through town, and that's probably completely in error. There's so much traffic that already goes today in this area that it's unsafe in the neighborhood, and the town has been very aggressive about routing traffic on Mill Street. So I think that really needs to be studied. Now the question is back to the safety on the site. At the 7% long stretch grade, I worry about, you talk about the largest vehicle in town. Let's just say we have a moving van coming down the hill that is not familiar with ice and snow conditions and starts to skid and jackknifes. Could that truck go off the side? Is the engineering such that a very large heavy vehicle will be kept on the roadway, or could it careen through the railings and go off the side, which is very steep, kind of like a cliff? And if the road needs to be kept safe with salt, so that is impossible to happen, that's such a volume of salt that it's going to pollute the waterways there. We had a similar problem on the development of Long Hill, and it was rejected because couldn't deal with the steepness or the amount of salt and the town wetland problems. So the question is safety and the 7% grade, salting, causing pollution, or saving lives.
You want me to answer a question as far as does it require a lot of salting in this site? Is that what you?
Yes, it would, to make that 7% grade safe for cars and trucks going up and down the hill, would it require a lot of salt in wintry conditions?
I don't know if there's other alternatives to salt that would be usable. I do know that I have not seen, there might be a plan, but I have not seen the plan of how winter conditions are going to be dealt with on this particular site because of the grades and the access. And again, I'm most concerned about going down the site driveway and approaching School Street. Even though you've got 100 feet of area that's clear, that's low grade, the high grade feeding into that is going to, again, make things difficult, especially when you're going around curves to approach that. Two curves, a double S curve, as a matter of fact. So I think that I've not seen the plan for the winter plan for access for this site. I think it's going to be critical that that be extremely effective, because since this is the only way in and out, I have to see them from Missouri show me that sort of thing. I have to see how this is all going to work. I have concerns.
And is the engineering of the guardrails such that very large vehicles can be kept safely on the road, even in the event of an accident?
Well, I haven't studied the guardrails for this particular site. I just really looked at the geometry of really just.
Okay, thank you.
Next one is Mr. Michael Carvalho.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Mr. Hilbert, I appreciate you, and I appreciate the skills that you brought to this. Let me ask you, in the absence of the second form of ingress or egress that you've discussed, is there any increased risk to life safety issues associated with this project?
I have to say yes. It's not as safe as without that second access. It's definitely not as safe. I can't go out and I can't sit here in a straight face and say that's fine, because it's not fine. I would like to see a second access. I don't know if it's possible, but I would definitely like to see a second access. This is not something I'm making up. It's stuff from publications all around the country that suggest that you have longer driveways like this with the number of units that's being proposed, you provide a second access.
Thank you, Mr. Hebert. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Next up is Andrea Fish.
Hi, Andrea Fish, 8 Washington Street. My original question was already asked. I was going to ask for examples of similar projects with long driveways, just because I just like to go look at them and see what they're like. But is Westboro the only one that comes to mind? And then if there aren't, or even if there are, I also wanted to ask, is the auto turn analysis available for normal citizens to look at?
Sure, when it becomes publicly available, it's fine. Anybody can look at it, I would guess. So.
Where is that?
I don't know where it is exactly, but the applicant said that they provided it at some point. I've not seen it.
So you haven't seen it, but is Mr. Engler, is he still on? Could he?
Yes, to Eli.
Excuse me?
I believe, Mr. Chairman, may I?
Sure, yes, you may.
I believe it's been submitted. It's definitely been submitted to the town. I don't know if it was posted. If not, we'll submit it again tomorrow. I mean, it's a matter of public record, just like anything else we've submitted.
Okay.
And Mr. Hebert, we definitely submitted you call it a winter condition plan. I think I would call it a snow storage plan. I think they're one and the same, unless you have a different idea. But that has been submitted as well.
I interpreted the auto turn to be some kind of a visual representation of the turning radii of the larger trucks and things like that. Is that not what it is?
No, you're correct. It shows the path that vehicles would take, specifically the fire truck, anticipating turning radii and movements throughout the proposed roadway network. So
Okay.
I think your expectation, I think the plan will be consistent with your expectations.
And off the top of your head, any other long over 1,000-foot cul-de-sacs other than Westboro?
I'll think about it and I'll submit something to the town. Mr. Hebert said it's less safe. I would agree with that. It doesn't mean it's unsafe. And there's plenty of projects in Massachusetts that have been permitted larger than this that have had one way in, one way out. The key is making sure that one way in, one way out is safe.
Thank you.
Becky, did you have a question?
I did, and it's just, I don't recall seeing, and this is, was already asked, but I don't recall seeing the auto turns, and I've been going back to things and I'm still not seeing them, so I would love to be able to have that put up on the site with everything else. On the 40B site. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. Thank you.
Yeah. Greg, were you commenting on that?
Sorry, Eli, I was just looking through the site now. I don't see it listed, so if it somehow got dropped, we will follow up, or if we didn't receive it, then Mr. Angley can get it to us and we'll put it up.
Okay, any other questions on the traffic report from members of the public? Yes, sir, I see a hand raised.
Yeah. Brian Miller, 92 School Street. I thank you for the presentations and the information obtained. I just want to make sure that I understand that this egress road into this new development is totally private and is not the responsibility of the towns.
Really, that's probably not true.
That is the current proposal, as I understand it.
Thank you.
Denny Hall.
Danny Hall, 20 Mascanoma Street. I'd be interested to hear what the fire chief has to say about the ability to deal with a fire at the property.
Chief Cleary, are you available?
I didn't see
sir,
him
I am.
on.
Go ahead, Jason.
With respect to, is there a more specific question?
Well, I gather that the questions are revolved around, in general, the ability of fire trucks, in your opinion, to navigate the site and the room for access. I know the questions have come up in the past and we have not addressed them recently. It's not entirely in the traffic area, but I'll allow it tonight. In general, we'll give you access to the needed access to the various different sides of the buildings.
Sure. The single entry point does not concern me in the fact that there are 2 lanes. There are crossovers on the boulevard side, the lower end, where that if there was a blockage in one lane, we could cross over and use the oncoming lane. If the median was gone, then we would have access to the full side of the road. I know they did come down to take measurements of our apparatus, and I saw the preliminary design and looked at the roundabout as to whether our apparatus can navigate the roadway, as well as was the roadway wide enough for us to set up our aerial apparatus, and it is. The building would be required to have all the latest fire protection devices, full fire alarm system, a full sprinkler system. We discussed having the proper hydrants in the locations where we needed them. The grade of the road is acceptable under an FPA. It is under 10%. The widths are acceptable. The wider, the better, but we do have the ability for our truck to make it up there and set up. With respect to access to the building, I know a lot of people have brought that up. The NFPA codes require that we can get a truck within 50 feet of one of the entrance doors, which we certainly can. And then it allows us, in a sprinklered building, it allows us 450 feet to be able to stretch a hose line. There is no NFPA requirement for our aerial ladder to have access to all sides of the building. So a roadway is not required all the way around the building. And it does not necessarily dictate that there needs to be a secondary or an emergency access road. There are several places in town. I know somebody mentioned earlier about the fire we had at University Lane. Part of that issue was a water supply issue due to an aging water main and being unable to get the volume we needed. The other thing, it was a private driveway, and residents are not required to keep their driveways plowed in case the fire department has to show up. But one thing we would be looking for here would be definitely a good snow removal plan so that none of the hydrants were blocked, so that the widths of the roadway were not decreased by snowbanks, that the road would be plowed and accessible to us at all times. So as much as we can build in an infrastructure that would take care of the fire, the access is not of a grave concern to me at all.
Next up was Catherine Creighton.
Hi, Catherine Creighton, 6 Ashland Ave. We've touched on this issue, but I wanted to ask specifically. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, we've touched on the issue, but I wanted to ask specifically, in the materials presented, it seems we're assuming that the considerable majority of tenants do not leave the property in the morning. And I just wanted to ask more about this assumption. And can you talk a little bit more about how you came to that?
No, that's not what the traffic data says. The traffic data says that during a 1 hour period, we're only expecting a limited number of vehicles to come out of the site related to the size of the building and the number of bedrooms that are on that site. And that's just based on national statistics. And whoever needs to get out of the building on a normal morning period, if there's 157 units and there's 157 drivers, they'll either get out of it. Now, some of them will carpool, a few will carpool, a few will have other ways of going wherever they're going. But I would hope that this site will have the maximum amount of carpooling to reduce trips from the site, because that's really going to be the key. The transit, shuttle, and the carpooling, that's really going to be key to servicing ways to get reduced traffic at this site. But that is a normal, the idea that the 1 hour period, the peak hour, is not going to have 157 cars going down is normally the situation with these types of developments. It's just, they spread out over time. As I said, it's the morning peak period is a 3.5 to 4 hour period. And that's what happens, and people don't all go out at once.
Okay, so it's carpooling and a shuttle that we're relying on here.
We're hoping that does really well, yes. Not this, but that's not was assumed in the study. The study assumed normal rates for this kind of development. That has nothing to do with carpooling or anything else. It's just that's what it would be without any kind of bus service or shuttles or anything like that. That's what the assumption. So what we're trying to do is even build on that and even reduce it beyond what's been assumed in the study.
All right, Gar Morse. I think that's Gar Morse, right?
All right, thanks, Eli. I just have a quick question. It's really to you, and it's regarding the obligation of the selectmen. Are the selectmen supposed to consider public safety as an issue before supporting a letter of whatever the lift letter or so forth for this project?
Supposed to? Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to ask John Whitten to say hello for a minute.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I mean, categorically, the answer is yes. There's no other way to answer that question other than to say categorically yes.
Thank you. Just wondering.
Any other members of the public? Any questions on or comments on traffic? All right, Sheila Hill. I'm going to make this last comment on traffic, and then we're going to move on. No, you're muted. Still muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Eli. Gary, I had a question. I wrote down a statement that you made, and I just wanted to check if it's accurate. You said you didn't do this analysis, you just reviewed the prior analysis.
That's correct. Well, I didn't do new analysis. I mean, I look at things and see if they did the analysis correctly, but I don't, my job is not to do brand new analysis. It's to review what the applicants submitted and tell you what my thoughts are.
You reviewed that analysis on December 29th, is that correct?
No, all I did, that was just
add anything to your analysis from
okay, all right, let's get one thing clear. The 29th was the day of the site visit. I actually happened to go down one more day. It was after that, but I just went down to Singing Beach and did one last drive around to make sure I understood the environment. But the analysis, the review of the materials took some time. I mean, it took effort. You can't do that in a few minutes. It takes several hours to go ahead and look at all the data and figure out what's going on and what's projected and how this works. So I didn't do analysis, but I did spend a lot of time looking at a lot of information that included more than just the typical traffic analysis.
I can see that from a lot of your presentation. I just wondered how representative you find this December 29th. I don't know what the weather was, but
it was cold. I can tell you that, it was very cold.
And maybe there weren't many cars out, as there wouldn't be anyway. But was it would you say it's 50% representative of the real traffic flow in a non-COVID summer?
When I went out, probably about, yeah, I would say in the range of 50 to even 40% of normal conditions. It was very low. Because it was cold out. When I went downtown, the parking spots were clearly not empty. And again, it was between Christmas and New Year's. And a lot of people are on vacation then, it was not a normal day.
So it's not particularly representative of what peak conditions in Manchester.
I can figure it out because again, I've looked at traffic for many, many years and I have a pretty good idea what is going on a regular basis out here. Even though I didn't see it the way I would like to normally see it, I do have a pretty good idea how busy it would be on a normal day.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Hebert, I thank you for your time. Oh, well, Sarah Wolfgang, I think you did have your hand raised a while before, so I will allow you comment.
I just had a question about a more general matter. Is that okay?
Let's let Mr. Hebert go if he's
Okay.
if there are more comments for him.
Okay, thanks.
So, Mr. Hebert, I thank you for your time tonight.
Welcome.
And
If you think of anything else, just let me know. I'll be glad to answer it. I've got more work to do and giving you a little brief memo about the difference between the 120 units and 157. That's something that's coming along. But other than that, just let me know what you need. I'll be glad to answer your question.
Yep. Any last comments from the board members to Mr. Hebert? All right. Thank you again, sir.
You're welcome.
All right, Sarah, go ahead with your general question.
So mine is more about the general financial analysis. And is there a member from the finance committee who could weigh in? Will the finance committee review the numbers and provide independent feedback? I think that we're waiting for this information. In a previous meeting, it was communicated that the town expected that the project would be a financial drag. This study suggests otherwise. What accounts for that sort of mixed information or mixed feedback?
Yes, we will be getting feedback from the finance committee on this. We don't have it yet because we just got these studies in. So finance committee will be chewing through them and we'll be reviewing the information and giving us some additional recommendations.
Thank you.
All right, it is coming up on 9 o'clock. The rest of this meeting is planned to be a discussion with the Board of Selectmen on our next steps and how we plan to move forward and engage with the developer. So just a moment. All right, so we have had Mr. Engler here tonight already to answer some questions for us, which I appreciate. Part of the next phase that we need to get into is actual sit down and talk with the developer between the Board of Selectmen and the developer regarding the project and where we might have concerns and where we want to see if we can negotiate conditions so that we can reach an approval and endorsement or not. And I know that Mr. Engler is anxious to get started in that process. I want to say I do appreciate patience in the matter. It's obviously a sensitive topic for a lot of people in town. And there's a reasonable expectation, I think, that the board take its time to gather whatever information it can to be able to have an informed discussion and not have the appearance of going too quickly into discussions around a topic on which we might not be informed. So for the rest of this meeting, I want to discuss where we stand, where the board stands with respect to the information we've received so far, some of the higher level questions that we've got about the project, and how we want to schedule up potentially a first meeting with the first actual meeting where we're discussing the conditions of the project with the developer. So I'd like to, Greg, actually first, the environmental presentation. When, if, are we, where do we stand with that?
So we have a quick overview of the various permits that are required. So I guess I'm looking for a little more guidance from all of you in terms of what additional information you would like to see regarding those required permits.
All right, well, let's take that one first. So go around the board and see if there are comments from the boards about the environmental permits. Who wants to go first? Or if anybody has any comments right now. If not, we can push.
I've got a question, Eli.
Go ahead, John.
Yes. So we've got some summary, I guess, of some of the permits that are required, Greg. And I don't have information on how those requirements stack up against what Manchester's requirements are. All I know is you need this permit and that permit, but how do the specifications compare relative to what we are used to approving and reviewing here in Manchester?
So the major difference will be with the State Wetlands Protection Act versus our local wetlands protections. Our local protections have required buffer zones where sometimes the state does not. I can have Chris Bertoni provide a quick summary of those differences for you.
Good. I would appreciate that, because in reviewing what we'd like to see from the developer, some of those things that we'd like to see might be perhaps more stringent requirements than what the state or what these permits involve. Now, that's not to say that that's absolutely what's going to happen, but at this point, we're putting together a list of what we'd like to see.
So I think that's probably the one area that you would find a difference.
Yes.
So I can give you those differences outlined.
Okay, good.
I have questions, of course.
Go ahead.
I guess one of my first ones was regarding the order of conditions for the Mass DEP, and what would, in lieu of a permit and allowing the developer to get the order of conditions, it says that they have to be, that there would be less than 5,000 square feet of fill. And how do we, I mean, there's a lot of rock that's going to be moved and altered. So how do we know that there's actually going to be less than 5,000 square feet? Because this does say that this is sort of a self-verification.
So there are ways to do quite, I'm sorry, there are ways to condition the permit in terms of what the ZBA would ask for verification. You can ask for engineering, stamped engineering drawings and verification of as-built and that sort of thing.
So can the ZBA be more stringent than the Mass DEP?
It's possible.
Am I freezing or is Greg freezing?
I can hear you, Becky. So it is possible. It's possible for the ZBA to do that. It's a question of whether or not that is appealed or not.
Okay. And is that something that then, is that a ZBA issue, or is that something that we would weigh in on?
So maybe I'll turn it over to John Winton for a comment or two on that.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the 5,000 square foot limitation is fill of bordering vegetated wetland, as opposed to 5,000 square feet of fill in general. So there is a state prohibition on filling more than 5,000 square feet of bordering vegetated wetland. There are exceptions to it, but that is where that number comes from. The State Wetlands Protection Act cannot be waived by the Board of Appeals or the Board of Selectmen. The local wetlands bylaw can be waived by the Board of Appeals if, in my opinion, but for the waiver, the project would be rendered uneconomic. And that's a conversation that I'm happy to have with the board at any time, what those phrases mean. As a general rule, all of the local regulations, whether it's the wetlands bylaw, subdivision regulations, or the zoning bylaw, those regulations are in place unless and until they're waived by the Board of Appeals. It's the applicant's burden to demonstrate that those waivers are required to keep the project from being uneconomic. The applicant bears that burden, and only the applicant bears that burden, not the town. Otherwise, we'd be in a perverse situation where town meeting adopts regulations every year and a developer asks for a waiver of them, and then unilaterally the Board of Appeals grants that waiver. That doesn't make any sense, and that's not how the statute works. The applicant bears the burden of showing, for example, that the local wetlands bylaw would render the project uneconomic. And until the applicant does that, the wetlands bylaw, as adopted by town meeting, and regulations as adopted by the Conservation Commission are in play and applicable to this and every other project. So, Becky, to answer your question directly, though, the Board of Appeals jurisdiction is not inclusive of the Wetlands Protection Act. It might be inclusive of the Wetland Protection Bylaw if the applicant can demonstrate that the bylaw or aspects of the bylaw render the project uneconomic. We're nowhere near that stage. At this point, the Board of Selectmen are being asked perhaps to suggest waivers or recommend waivers to the Board of Appeals, but I don't even think we're at that stage. At this stage, the Board of Selectmen are seeking to negotiate what kind of permit conditions the applicant will agree to, what kind of on or off-site benefits the applicant will agree to. The real detail, the weeds, so to speak, of these kind of conversations really are best left to the adjudicatory body, which in this case is the Board of Appeals. Now, I'm not at all saying the Board of Selectmen don't have a role here. You do, but the details are best left to the Board of Appeals, because what you have before you simply is not detailed enough to weigh in on those kind of decisions.
Right.
And it's not the applicant's fault. That's just the way this process works. You don't have detailed plans.
Okay, thank you. And I should have stated that it was the bordering vegetated wetlands. I should have specified that. I have another question, Eli, if I may, and this probably should go to John as well.
Sure, go ahead.
And it is, what does it mean under the United States Environmental Protection Agency, where this was provided to us by SLV, but it said that the CGP, being the construction general permit, authorizes the discharge of stormwater, but then in parentheses it says, and certain authorized non-stormwater discharges. Do you know what those certain authorized non-stormwater discharges means? And it specifically, it says from construction sites that disturb 1 or more acres.
Right. So that's the general permit through the Army Corps of Engineers, and it's linked to the Clean Water Act, which is under the jurisdiction of EPA. So those are typically non-point source discharges that take place during construction. So runoff, soil erosion, and other construction-related runoffs. The point sources, the stormwater discharge, is regulated through both the Massachusetts Stormwater Management Standards as well as the Clean Water Act. And if I could, Mr. Chairman, just to respond a little more fully, all of this conversation ties into the relevance of vernal pools that exist on the property, as well as bordering vegetated wetland, because if the vernal pools are certified, they become what are called outstanding resource waters, and stormwater cannot be discharged to an outstanding resource water. So it's again, more detail than we have in front of us now, but those are relevant from a site planning perspective. In this case, the applicant has proposed the site plan without, as far as I can tell, without really knowing the level of detail of the environmental constraints. It's a little bit backwards, but welcome to Massachusetts. This is well, Mr. Engler's shaking his head, but as far as I know, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Engler is neither a hydrologist nor a hydrogeologist nor a wetland scientist. So if I could finish my comment, the relevance of the environmental issues or environmental constraints on the property from the Board of Selectmen's perspective is, do we get to know what the constraints are before we endorse a project? And again, the reverse is commonly the case from a site planning perspective. Know the constraints, and then you know what land you have to work with in terms of buildable area.
Thank you. And I do have one more question for John. Again, Eli, if I may.
Yeah.
It is under the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. It talks, there was a question about filings and requirements. Are there, where do we find what these requirements are? I'm not, it seemed a little vague what I was reading.
It's the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA, and
Yep.
it's an arm of the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, Energy and Environmental Affairs. And it is a filing that developments that trigger certain triggers are required to make. And they come in two categories. This project will clearly trigger an ENF, an environmental notification form. It may trigger an EIR, but it's not large enough to categorically trigger an EIR, but it will trigger an ENF because it meets the at least two of the criteria required. So that's something the applicant files with the Commonwealth. MEPA doesn't issue a permit. It's a review process. The town will get some feedback from the state, but not a permit. And typically when it's a comprehensive permit, a 40B application, MEPA has endorsed these projects almost hook, line, and sinker. So I think the town can expect that the MEPA process might be helpful, but the town should not expect that the state will exert any authority over the MEPA process. It's a process of collecting information and disseminating it, and it can occur early or it can occur later. If the applicant appeals to the Housing Appeals Committee, they must file an ENF within 10 days of the filing. So it's really the applicant's choice. Again, most developers in market rate projects will choose to do it early because then they can get feedback as to what the site's constraints are.
Okay, and I asked that question because specifically this said that the project does not meet or exceed any MEPA review thresholds for wetlands, wastewater, transportation. Therefore, the current development program will not require any filings with MEPA.
Well, it's a project that is going to require a comprehensive permit. A comprehensive permit requires assistance from DHCD at a minimum if it's a LIP, and it's going to trigger at least one of the other categories. So in my opinion, an ENF needs to be filed.
Thank you very much for that clarification, John. I don't know how you keep track of all these acronyms. It's a different language. Thank you.
Any other board members, questions or comments on the environmental side right now? All right. So I'm actually, there was something that was helpful to me before we move on. in this discussion. I was actually going to ask John Whitten to take a moment and talk about this process. John, at one point you described to me the normative or non-normative aspects of this type of project, and what we can expect to have known to the board, and what we can't, and what will become known or more detailed to the before the Zoning Board of Appeals, and therefore where the focus of the Board of Selectmen is currently. Do you mind reviewing that for everybody?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the way we discussed it previously, and I think it's still accurate today, the Board of Selectmen are being asked to endorse the project. So you're the chief elected officials. The applicant is asking you to lend your support, and the political weight that you carry and the connections in terms of being the appointing authority for the Board of Appeals. So it's really a political process. So the Board of Selectmen are not sitting in judgment over the project. You're not the adjudicators. That's the Board of Appeals. The Board of Selectmen are really negotiating a deal for the town of Manchester, in the best interest of the town of Manchester. The applicant, to its credit, has chosen this route as opposed to the other route, and has given the Board of Selectmen an opportunity to negotiate. If it works, that's good for both parties. If it doesn't work, then the applicant can choose other options if it wants to. So my advice always on a lip is not for the Board of Selectmen to get in the weeds, because if you get in the weeds, then you start to become the adjudicators, and that's not your bailiwick. That's what the Board of Appeals does, or the planning board in other circumstances. So I think the way you're proceeding, really from 1,000 miles high, bad metaphor here because you're not 1,000 miles high, but you're not in the weeds. So somewhere in between the weeds and 1,000 miles is where the Board of Selectmen are, to negotiate a deal to set the stage for the Board of Appeals. And whatever those conditions are going to be binding on the Board of Appeals, because your endorsement has to get approved by DHCD. And DHCD's approval is the ticket to the Board of Appeals. That's the project eligibility letter. So if the Board of Selectmen say, for example, with the applicant, we will approve X number of units and no more, that is the maximum number that the applicant can file with the Board of Appeals. So you're setting the stage for the detailed review of the Board of Appeals. You're not doing that yourself. And of course, there's going to be some variations. You might be very, very concerned about an intersection. So you do want to get in the weeds on that intersection. But generally speaking, whether it's wetlands protection, stormwater runoff, or even architectural design, generally speaking, that is kind of left to the adjudication. You can choose to get in the weeds or you can back away, but you're limiting what the project can be through negotiations with the applicant, and you're also extracting public benefits from the applicant that, of course, the applicant has to agree to, that the Board of Appeals then won't be burdened by. So if whether it's open space set aside or access to the property or trail connections, those are conditions that the Board of Appeals doesn't have to bear the burden of imposing, because remember, the Board of Appeals is being judged on whether they've rendered the project uneconomic. So everything the Board of Appeals requires is going to be like a cash register that the applicant's going to add up. You've asked for this, you've asked for this, you've asked for this. That's too much, no more. That is not a constraint that you have. You're negotiating on equal territory. An applicant that goes to a Board of Appeals in a community that isn't consistent with local needs, it's not a level playing field. The Board of Appeals has one hand, maybe a hand and a half tied behind its back. That's why 40B is such a controversial statutory scheme, because it's not fair to cities and towns. But that is not what's happening right now. Now the applicant and the Board of Selectmen are on the level playing field, and you can negotiate anything that's in the public interest to protect the town of Manchester. And that's the 1,000-mile high analogy. I don't think you need to get into the weeds.
So I asked Mr. Whidden to go over that in part to help remind us all as we're going through the next few parts of this process, what our focus really needs to be, and also to help explain to the residents that this process is an odd process. In a normal large development process, before permission is given to a developer to proceed, all the designs are laid out. The planning board says yes, the zoning board says yes. There are a lot of stages where or most or all of the information is known in advance. And this project feels a little bit backwards in that respect, because it feels like the town is being asked to give its approval before knowing all of the information. And I know a lot of people don't like that feeling. Shoot, I don't like that feeling. So I think it's important to realize that what the Board of Selectmen is doing here is trying to see if we can establish a high-level set of constraints that would allow us to live with and endorse the project. And those constraints would then go into the Board of Appeals, and the Board of Appeals would then start working on, and the Conservation Commission and other commissions would then start working on all the details. So I say this in advance because it's the Board of Selectmen's job now to go and start having discussions about these constraints with the developer. And over the next little while, as we have those discussions, it may feel like we're having those discussions before we have all the information. And the answer is, yeah, that's true. But in this strange process, we can't have all of the information before we have some of these discussions. The Zoning Board of Appeals will be the place where more of the information, more of the peer reviews, more of the studies come into play, and more of the information is developed. So the Board of Selectmen, instead of generating a lot of highly detailed constraints, will be focusing on delivering some high-level constraints and conditions and negotiating those with the developer, and hopefully coming to an agreement over those. And those constraints, those high-level constraints, are going to be the attempt of the Board of Selectmen to satisfy our own concerns, and also to try to satisfy the concerns of all the residents who have been expressing their concerns. I know a lot of residents, or some residents, frankly, simply would not like the project to move forward. This little phase that we're in is not about the Board of Selectmen deciding whether or not to allow the project to go forward. That's actually not within our power right now. It's to decide whether or not we think we can develop a set of constraints that would serve the residents and serve the town if the project did go forward as with some sort of mutual agreement with the developer. So I wanted to once again reiterate all that before we get into this strange process where we're sitting down with the developer and negotiating, which is going to be a very public process. All these meetings are going to be public over the next few weeks as we go through this. All right. So originally it was my intent to go into some detail about how we try to button up some of the more of the details before we potentially got into a discussion of scheduling when to actually meet and with the developer, talking about our initial sets of concerns and constraints. To some extent, Mr. Engler, we've talked about those tonight, but not obviously. It's been a little bit ad hoc. I think we've been at this for about 3 hours. We spent a lot more time on the traffic studies and the fiscal studies, answering questions of the public, answering questions of the board than I had anticipated. What I would like to do, I think, is to schedule another workshop meeting next week with the board to go into some details and schedule a time for our first official sort of negotiating meeting with SLV, if that's okay with board members. Comments?
If I may.
Yes, please, Ann.
I think that would be a very wise decision. I think we've got a lot of information tonight, both from the studies and from the comments. And I would like to think about it rather than launching into a list of detail at almost 9:30.
I agree.
I'm good.
All right.
You know.
So we do have a regular board meeting.
Eli,
Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
can we, I agree that we need to not get into the conditions tonight, the specific conditions tonight. But can we set a date with Mr. Engler tonight?
I think we can certainly set an objective. So yeah, I think we should. So I was going to say that we have the Board of Selectmen has a meeting next Tuesday, a regular meeting. I am realizing now that if I wanted the opportunity to have us discuss things then, I should have put a 40B item in there, and I did not. So what I would suggest is that we schedule another Thursday meeting next week. We knew that this was going to be a busy time of year. And then schedule a meeting for the week following to meet with Mr. Engler.
Mr. Chairman, do you want me at the meeting next Thursday or to attend, I should say, or?
Well, I think this is us sorting through. I mean, it's going to be an open meeting. You're obviously free to attend, but this is, I think this is intended for this next phase was for us intended to get our thoughts in order so that we could organize what we want to talk about before having a first round with you and your team.
But should I put the 28th on my calendar?
The 28th. That sounds all right to me. How about board members? It's Thursday, the 28th.
I can do that. I mean, is that, yeah, I can do that. At 6:30, are we saying, or would that work for Mr. Engler?
6:30 is fine with me, whatever the board prefers.
I'm good with that.
Fine.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Whitten.
I apologize. I have a hearing on the 28th in Ipswich that evening. You know, I don't want to throw your schedule off because of me. I'm free on the 27th if that works for Mr. Engler and for the board. I just can't do the 28th. I apologize.
27th, all right with folks?
27 works for me.
Yeah.
Mr. Engler?
Fine with me, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all.
And then the Board of Selectmen, the 14th, January 14th, also at 6:30.
14th is today.
What's that?
The 14th is today.
Oh, you're right. It is. I'm sorry. I apologize. The 21st is the one I meant.
Yep. That's fine with me.
Works for me.
Yep.
And then the 27th, 6:30.
Yeah. And our regular meeting is on the 19th. And I'm assuming that Sarah Malish is going to tell me something purely logistic in nature that's going to throw all this right out the window. What is it, Sarah?
Sarah has a ZBA meeting, but on the 20th.
She's going to tell you there's a finance committee meeting on the 27th.
Well, and the 21st, actually.
My mute is not working. But yes. We've scheduled our finance committee for next week, Thursday, because the BOS is on Tuesday. And we've had to change our meeting for the fourth week in January to Thursday. So we're challenged.
So you Thursday the 21st and Thursday the 28th?
I thought it was 27th, but I could be wrong.
It's the 27th.
20th and 27th.
21 and 27. So Thursday and Wednesday, at least on the calendar.
Okay. We're having really challenges getting Zoom meetings.
Okay. I'll tell you what, let's try to proceed anyway.
Eli, our meeting on the 27th, I think there's a public meeting for the school committee.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't meet on Wednesday, so we moved it to Thursday.
Yeah.
I'm juggling.
You mean you moved the meeting from the 20th to the 21st? Is that right?
26th to the 28th.
Sarah, the 26th
It's
is
the
the school
27th.
committee meeting.
Is what?
26th is the school committee meeting, and we
Right.
moved to the 28th.
We moved the FinCom to the 28th.
Right, and the 40B is on the 27th.
Okay.
Okay.
So the
Yeah.
only conflict at the moment is the 21st.
What's the 21st?
40B and Finance Committee.
Well, we've got no choice, We have the ZBA on the 20th and we can't move it. We're challenged.
Yep.
We are.
Well, I think that we're going to need to proceed and sort of caveat our conditions and comments based on the fact that we haven't got all the input yet from the Finance Committee needs. These will be some initial discussions and we'll have a few of these meetings. So we'll have time to gather input before we finalize any of our discussions. And it is a challenging time of year. There's a lot that we're trying to pack in. I think we're just going to have to roll with it.
And Zoom is a challenge and, I don't know what to do. I'm frustrated.
Well, Yeah, Zoom can be a challenge. Zoom also has the advantage that, we have a lot more people coming to these meetings than ordinarily we would, which is nice. We get to have a lot of people contributing to the discussions that otherwise might not be able to.
We just don't have enough accounts.
Oh, I see.
We can get another account if it's really a logjam.
I think so. We need it. It's so frustrating.
Oh, I didn't realize that was the problem. I thought you were just complaining about Zoom.
No,
All right.
there's not enough accounts.
That's a different problem. All right, message received. We'll see what we can do. All right, so we've got our schedule lined up here. Any other comments or questions from board before we move things along for tonight? And by saying move things along, I say take a motion to adjourn. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved. Second.
I like everybody.
Is that fast enough?
And that was moved by Jeff Bodmer Turner. What? Yeah, no, you lose this time. Any discussion? Roll call vote. Mr. Bodmer Turner.
Yes.
Mr. Round.
Yes.
Ms. Jakes.
Yes.
Ms. Harrison.
Yes.
Mr. Bowling votes yes. Good night, folks, and thanks very much for participating.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Eli.
Good night. Thank you. Thank you all.